The room seemed to tighten as Richard Posner leaned across the polished wood of the committee table, his eyes narrowing with the certainty of a man who believed the spotlight belonged to him. His words slid into the air like a challenge, each syllable wrapped in the kind of condescension that dares the listener to flinch. Cameras whirred, catching every angle of his confident smirk, and for a heartbeat, the chamber felt smaller, as if the oxygen itself waited to see what would happen next. Outside the hearing, 1,000 screens lit up in living rooms, coffee shops, and subway cars. Headlines erupted in real time. Richard Posner tries to humiliate Jasmine Crockett, gets destroyed by her wins. The text pulsed across feeds in red and black, a digital drum roll announcing a storm that had only begun to gather. Gasps rippled through the audience like a sudden wind. A woman in the front row pressed her hand to her mouth. Somewhere in the back, a college student lifted a phone higher, live streaming to friends who were already flooding group chats with fire emojis. On Twitter, first one, then a dozen, then hundreds of posts appeared. "Did you hear that? She's about to end him." Jasmine Crockett sat perfectly still. No flash of irritation, no twitch of impatience crossed her face. She adjusted the microphone with deliberate care, her calm presence a quiet rebuke to the theatrics unfolding before her. Those who knew her history, her relentless fights for community, her sharp command of the law, recognized the almost imperceptible spark in her eyes. It wasn't anger. It was preparation. Posner, unaware or unwilling to notice, pressed on, stacking rhetorical bricks into a wall he believed unassailable. His voice rose a shade too high, the cadence of someone certain victory was already his. Each sentence carried the weight of a man convinced that pedigree and posture would drown out principle. And then a hush, heavy and expectant, settled over the chamber. Viewers across the country leaned closer to their screens, hearts thudding in unison. Something electric shimmered in the pause, a collective breath held tight. Because no one in that chamber, least of all Richard Posner, could predict the comeback that was about to set the internet ablaze. Outside the chamber, the nation was already watching. This wasn't just another policy discussion buried in the evening news. It was a hearing carried live on every major network, a broadcast beamed into living rooms from Portland to Miami. The stakes were nothing less than the credibility of public service itself. At issue were questions that reached far beyond the polished table and high-backed chairs. Who gets to define truth? Who holds power to account when that power wraps itself in prestige and precedent? Inside, the atmosphere throbbed with that awareness. Staffers moved with the quick, quiet efficiency of people who knew every camera was capturing each movement. Journalists perched on the edges of their seats, fingers hovering over keyboards. The air buzzed with an almost electrical charge, a sense that something larger than procedure was about to unfold. Richard Posner basked in it. Years of courtroom victories and televised interviews had trained him to treat the spotlight as a familiar ally. He wore confidence like a tailored suit, and today it gleamed brighter than ever. His opening remarks dripped with polished certainty, each phrase calibrated to remind the room of his formidable resume. A slight tilt of the head here, a subtle pause there, small gestures meant to signal authority and superiority. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett offered no reaction beyond the calm rhythm of her breath. She listened, eyes steady, a stillness that unsettled those who recognized its weight. She had spent her career standing with people whose voices were often drowned out, and that history lent her a quiet power. While Posner's words stacked high like a brittle tower, she remained motionless, a single, steady flame. The larger issues pressed in from all sides. This wasn't just about the legal technicalities under discussion. It was about whether public officials could still embody honesty in a time when cynicism came cheap. It was about whether democratic values, transparency, accountability, equality could hold their own against ego and spectacle. For immigrants watching from across the country, for communities who had been told to wait their turn, this moment carried a charge of recognition. Dignity doesn't need volume to speak. Social media sensed it too. Hashtags bloomed mid-hearing, first tentative, then fervent. Clips of Posner's confident monologue were already circulating with captions like "classic grandstanding" and "watch her face, she's planning something." Viewers could feel the tension building, the inevitability of a turn. Posner mistook the silence for surrender. He leaned forward, voice tightening into the sharp edges of someone sure of victory. Each new barb came a little quicker, a little louder, as though he were accelerating toward a finish line only he could see. He didn't notice the way Crockett's hands rested lightly on the table, relaxed but ready, like a pianist poised before the opening note. The chamber itself seemed to lean toward her. Even those unfamiliar with her record sensed the undercurrent of strategy in her measured breathing. There was no hint of rattling, no flicker of doubt, only the quiet composure of someone who had weathered harder storms. And still, Posner pressed on, stacking argument upon argument, blind to the crack forming beneath his own words. He believed he was tightening the noose, that each clever remark left her with less room to move. But while he thought he had her cornered, Jasmine Crockett was already charting a path through every trap he set, each silent moment sharpening her eventual strike. When Posner thought he had her cornered, he unknowingly set his own trap. Rewind the scene, long before the applause, before the silence, before Judge Thapar's words of reverence, there was only doubt. Doubt whispered in headlines, shouted on cable news, murmured in the marble hallways of power. Jasmine Crockett had stepped into a case that wasn't just complex, it was radioactive. It carried political consequences, media frenzy, and the kind of scrutiny designed to break careers, not make them. Every outlet had their take. Commentators smirked, predicting her collapse. Pundits with polished smiles declared she was out of her depth. Social feeds swarmed with half-truths, caricatures, and relentless ridicule. The weight pressing on her shoulders wasn't just the burden of law, it was the collective judgment of a country conditioned to underestimate her. The case itself was no ordinary dispute. It touched raw nerves at the core of American identity. Who gets to speak? Who gets to be heard? Who gets to claim dignity in the face of dismissal? The stakes weren't measured only in statutes and precedents. They were measured in lives, in credibility, in the silent pride of communities waiting for someone to refuse to bend. For Crockett, every motion filed, every objection raised was more than procedure. It was resistance. Inside the courtroom, the pressure was suffocating. Cameras lined the back wall. Journalists filled the benches, their pens ready to turn any slip into a headline. The air itself seemed heavy with expectation, the kind that crushes or forges, leaving no middle ground. And yet outside those doors, the tension was even sharper. Supporters knew what was at stake. To them, she wasn't just an attorney, she was a mirror. An affirmation that brilliance, no matter its skin, its accent, or its story, could not be denied forever. Every attack on her competence was felt by millions who had heard the same words in their own lives: not enough, not qualified, not ready. Her opponents, meanwhile, sharpened their blades. They framed her as reckless, inexperienced, even dangerous. They laughed at the idea she could withstand the cross-examination, the intellectual traps, the crushing weight of precedent wielded against her. In their eyes, this wasn't a trial. It was an ambush. They didn't just want to win the case. They wanted to break her. And Crockett knew it.
She walked into the chamber aware that one falter could be magnified into a national spectacle, that one misstep would not be forgiven. The silence before she spoke was the silence of millions holding their breath, waiting to see if their reflection would stand or fall. This wasn't just law. This was history being written under the glare of judgment. A confrontation not merely of legal arguments, but of worldviews. Was brilliance enough to cut through bias? Could truth still stand taller than arrogance in an age when theater often overshadowed fact? For days leading up to the hearing, the drumbeat of doubt grew louder. Commentators rolled their eyes, detractors mocked her very presence, and even allies whispered in worry. Yet Crockett remained still, deliberate, calculating every move. To her, the battle was larger than herself. She carried the stories of families who had fought too hard to be overlooked again. She carried the weight of history and the stubborn belief that law, when wielded with clarity, could still pierce through prejudice. And as the doors to the courtroom swung open, every eye turned. Their detractors grinned, already convinced they would feast on her downfall. Supporters prayed silently, clenching their hands, refusing to blink. The moment was set, but the person she faced wasn't going to make it easy.
Before Jasmine Crockett's brilliance lit the courtroom, the stage had been set by those who doubted her. The antagonists of this story were not confined to a single face or a single argument. They were a chorus of voices, woven from rivals at the opposing table, pundits behind studio lights, and politicians who had long made a career out of belittling women like her. Their confidence was not quiet determination, it was arrogance. And arrogance, as history often shows, is the seed of its own downfall. Inside the courtroom, the lead opposing counsel wore his disdain like armor. He was older, seasoned, known for his sharp elbows and sharper tongue. To him, Crockett was an easy mark, a younger attorney, untested at this level, ripe for dismantling. He carried himself with the smugness of someone who had been told for years that he was the smartest man in the room. His strategy was not just to win the case, it was to humiliate, to reduce Crockett to a footnote in his personal highlight reel. Beyond the chamber, commentators amplified the same narrative. Cable news panels chuckled at her chances. One host leaned back in his chair and sneered into the camera, "She's not ready for this kind of fight. This isn't a classroom debate, it's real law." Another cut in with a smirk, "She's more activist than attorney. Watch, she'll fold." The clips circulated online, their smug certainty fueling threads of mockery, memes painting her as overmatched, drowning before the hearing even began. Political opponents added their voices, eager to exploit the spotlight.
They spoke in sound bites crafted for viral spread, dripping with condescension. "She's in over her head," one declared at a press conference. Another went further. "This is what happens when you elevate someone for identity instead of ability." At rallies, the lines drew cheers. The crowd fed on the caricature, convinced they were watching the setup to a very public collapse. But arrogance blinds, and the blind rarely see the cracks forming under their feet. Their overconfidence was revealed in small ways, ways that history, with hindsight, now finds almost laughable. In interviews, opposing counsel boasted of his airtight case, waving away Crockett's filings as rookie efforts. Commentators joked about how quickly the judge would put her in her place. Politicians gleefully retweeted each other's dismissals, certain they were witnessing the final scene of a short-lived career. They underestimated her. Worse, they underestimated what she represented. To them, Crockett was just another name in the docket, another upstart to swat aside. What they failed to grasp was that her presence in that courtroom was not accidental, it was inevitable. She carried into that space not just her own preparation, but the aspirations of millions who had been overlooked, doubted, or dismissed in exactly the same way. Arrogance is loud, but it is also fragile. Behind the smirks and headlines, there was an unspoken assumption. Crockett would play her part as they imagined it. She would stumble, she would sweat, she would confirm their prejudices with silence or error. Their certainty in that outcome became their blind spot. They stopped preparing for her brilliance because they couldn't imagine it existing. And so while they laughed, she studied. While they mocked, she strategized. While they built their case on assumptions of superiority, she sharpened her words into weapons that would cut through those very assumptions. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, the contrast was stark. The opposition boasted to the press about their inevitable victory, basking in the glow of their own certainty. Crockett, meanwhile, spoke rarely, letting her silence gather weight. Reporters noted the difference, but dismissed it as nerves. Only later would they realize it was composure. Their sound bites, once cutting, aged badly, turned brittle in the light of what followed. Clips of commentators mocking her were replayed against the thunder of the courtroom applause, their sneers now monuments to short-sightedness. Politicians who had weaponized her supposed incompetence found their words thrown back at them in montages that went viral. "She's in over her head," spliced directly against Judge Thopper's words, "absolutely brilliant." The arrogance of her detractors, once their shield, became their indictment. History does not forgive hubris when it collides with truth. And in that courtroom, truth was about to speak louder than their laughter ever had. They believed they were facing a woman too small for the stage. They didn't realize the stage itself was too small for what she carried. But while they clung to arrogance, Crockett carried something they never expected.
The insult might have lasted just a few seconds, but the weight of it carried centuries. Kellyanne Conway wasn't simply mocking a single congresswoman, she was reaching into the oldest, ugliest playbook of American politics: discredit, demean, and dismiss. For those watching at home, it might have looked like a petty exchange, but inside that chamber, every word shimmered with consequence. Conway's barb wasn't just about Jasmine Crockett, it was about what she represented. Because Crockett stood at the intersection of so many struggles, a black woman in a seat of power historically dominated by men, a new voice in a Congress often defined by entrenched dynasties, a representative of communities long dismissed, overlooked, or ridiculed. When Conway went after her, it wasn't just one politician attacking another. It was a cultural collision, live on national television. And everyone in that room knew it. The atmosphere shifted. Reporters in the press gallery scribbled faster, some already typing out headlines they knew would light up phones across America. Conway targets Crockett in explosive exchange. But the real story wasn't the insult itself, it was what the insult symbolized. For one side, it was arrogance dressed up as confidence. For the other, it was dignity under fire. And beneath it all, a bigger question loomed. Who gets to define America's values? The old guard with their familiar tactics, or a rising generation demanding respect, accountability, and truth? Crockett understood the stakes. She wasn't just a congresswoman fending off a cheap shot. She was a symbol, whether she asked to be or not. Millions of people outside that chamber, veterans' families, working-class communities, people who had endured the sting of mockery for their identity, were watching, hoping her silence would break into something unforgettable. Because in that silence, the pressure mounted. Each passing second seemed to carry the weight of expectations, of history, of unfinished fights. Crockett wasn't just sitting at a desk in Congress. She was sitting at the crossroads of America's battles over race, gender, class, and truth itself. And Conway, she had unwittingly thrown gasoline onto that fire. The hearing was supposed to be routine, policy debates, testimonies, the usual political theater. But in that instant, it transformed into something else, a showdown that would ripple far beyond Capitol Hill. Clips would be cut, tweets would fly, pundits would pounce, and the way Crockett answered would not just define the moment, it could define her career. She knew it, Conway knew it, and the chamber knew it. When the stakes rise this high, silence becomes unbearable. The nation was leaning in, breath held, waiting for the moment Jasmine Crockett would finally speak. Because this wasn't about just winning an argument. It was about reclaiming dignity, about proving that arrogance and mockery, no matter how practiced, could still be dismantled by truth. And when that truth finally came, it wouldn't just answer Conway's insult. It would echo across America. This moment would travel far beyond Capitol Hill.
Kellyanne Conway didn't stumble into this moment by accident. She carried with her a reputation that had been carefully sharpened over years in the public arena. A reputation built on spin, deflection, and the art of saying the unbelievable with absolute confidence. To her supporters, she was clever, quick-witted, the master of turning a question upside down until it meant nothing at all. To her critics, she was the embodiment of political arrogance, the smirk behind the phrase alternative facts. It wasn't the first time she'd courted outrage. It wasn't even the 100th. Conway had built a career out of playing with the line between truth and theater, often crossing it with a smile. She could dismiss entire scandals with a wave of her hand, mock opponents with a laugh, and make cynicism sound like charm. But what made her dangerous in a room like Congress was something deeper. She believed she could always win the stage, that no matter the setting, no matter the opponent, she could outtalk, outspin, and outmaneuver. Pride became her armor. Arrogance became her shield. And yet that arrogance was also her Achilles heel, because pride, when unchecked, blinds you to the moment the ground shifts beneath your feet. Conway's history was filled with moments that seemed small in isolation, but painted a larger portrait of disregard. She dismissed questions from journalists with condescension. She waved off concerns from ordinary Americans as if their struggles were background noise. She treated hearings like stages and opponents like props in her performance. She had a habit of making the personal political, mocking, needling, cutting down with words meant to sting more than persuade. And in doing so, she often revealed the very contempt she tried to conceal. That's what made her jab at Jasmine Crockett so loaded. It wasn't just a slip of the tongue. It was Conway reverting to type, the reflex of someone who had long thrived on belittling others to assert her own dominance. And history shows us those who rise on mockery often fall by dignity. The foreshadowing was written in every exchange Conway had ever had. The pride in her posture, the smirk when she delivered her lines, the way she seemed to lean back as if expecting applause for her audacity. But what happens when the applause doesn't come? What happens when the room doesn't laugh, but instead stiffens with shock? That was the danger Conway didn't see. In her mind, this was another performance, another moment to dominate the conversation and clip it for headlines. But in reality, she had just overplayed her hand. Because across from her wasn't a timid opponent. It wasn't someone who would crumble under the weight of her practiced smirk. Across from her sat Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had built her entire life around standing tall when others tried to belittle her. The audience, lawmakers and journalists, and millions watching online began to realize the contrast. On one side, arrogance, old tricks, the voice of someone who had spent a career making politics about clever insults. On the other, composure, stillness, and the promise of something far more powerful than mockery. This was the framing the moment demanded. Conway as the archetype of pride before the fall. She didn't know it yet, but the stage she thought she was owning was about to become the stage of her undoing. And that's why this mattered for the audience at home. Because Conway wasn't just one political figure, she was a stand-in for every voice of arrogance that dismissed, mocked, or tried to silence the experiences of ordinary people. This is who we're up against. And when arrogance meets dignity, history has a way of choosing its favorite.